words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, my Lord, my rock, and my Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Superman wasn't always Superman, you know. He came to Earth as a baby, a survivor from the doomed planet of Krypton. His home world lost to him forever. He landed in Smallville and was raised in a wholesome farming community, and he dedicated himself to championing his new world. Peter Parker wasn't always Spider-Man. He didn't dedicate his life to fighting crime simply because he had spider-like superpowers, but because his Uncle Ben was murdered by a burglar that Peter Parker had failed to apprehend earlier. And Bruce Wayne wasn't always Batman. He prepared himself for a life of fighting crime after witnessing his own parents' murder as a boy. If you're familiar with the world of comic book superheroes, you've heard these origin stories before. But I'm reminding you of them because I want you to think about how important they are. You see, it isn't just their superpowers that make these characters heroes. They're superheroes because an experience transformed them. An event gave them a new identity and mission in life. And their new identity guided them in every challenge that lay ahead. You might say they each experienced a kind of baptism that made them who they are. And that's how Israel understood its own identity and mission. The transformative event for them came as they escaped from Egypt after 400 years of slavery. And you know how that story goes, too. Moses led them to the Red Sea, struck the water with his staff, the sea split, and the Israelites crossed through on dry land. When Pharaoh and his army pursued, they were drowned. But Israel emerged from those waters with a new identity and a new purpose. They passed through the deadly sea and entered a new life, a whole new world, a new identity. They were no longer slaves, but God's very own children. They had been baptized. But the Exodus was just an echo of an even earlier event. In our first lesson, we read about Noah and his family, how they emerged from the great flood as God's renewed people, tasked with repopulating and caring for a creation that had been washed clean. They too passed through death and entered a new world with a new identity. They had been baptized. But even that story is an echo of an even earlier one. One you might say is the earliest of all, from the first chapter of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 1, God tames the dark, chaotic waters of the unformed universe and draws our world out of it and establishes his very first children in the Garden of Eden. The world itself was baptized to become God's home with us. Do you see the pattern? God always faithfully leads his people through danger, through trial, through death itself, and makes us his children. God baptizes us into our identity and our mission. And Jesus lives into that same pattern in this morning's gospel lesson. just like Israel did centuries earlier, just like Noah did millennia before that, just like the first chapter of Genesis. Jesus symbolically passes through the waters of chaos and death, and when he emerges, his Father proclaims from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And he immediately enters the wilderness to face our greatest enemy, to destroy the works of the devil and remake us and the whole world. And notice that here too, Jesus isn't defined by his superpowers. In fact, he hasn't even performed a single miracle yet. How does he win the battle? What's the source of his strength? Although he was born the divine Son of God, it was through baptism that he took up the official mantle of God's Son. In baptism, Jesus takes up his identity and his mission. And this is so important, so make sure you get this. Guess what Satan's strategy is for defeating Jesus? It's not in this morning's gospel lesson from Mark, but Matthew. He tempts Jesus to doubt his identity as God's Son. 2 of the 3 temptations start with, if you're really the Son of God, if you're really the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. If you're really the Son of God, throw yourself down from the pinnacle of the temple and let the angels catch you. Do you get it? Jesus' mission and the source of his power is his identity as God's Son. And so Satan launches his attacks there. Satan attacks his baptism. But baptism isn't just how the story begins. It's an ongoing pattern. It's the story embedded in every trial, every temptation, and every victory. For Jesus and us, every trial comes with the temptation to doubt we are really God's children. In every trial, there's a voice that says, if you're really a child of God, if you're really God's beloved, why are you suffering so much? Why does your body hurt so much? Why doesn't he or she love you more? Why do you feel so alone? Why is your life so hard? And ultimately, it's the pattern of the cross itself. On the cross, Jesus was taunted again and again with similar words. If you're the Messiah, come on down off of that cross. He claims to be able to save others. He can't even save himself. Do you see it? The cross was Jesus' final baptism and our final baptism. But the cross wasn't the end. Jesus entered death itself through the cross and was raised to new and unending life, the firstborn of the new creation. And there it is again. That's baptism. Baptism is passing through death and entering new life. That's our identity and our mission. And do you understand what that means? It means that resurrection power has been worked into every molecule of your being, into every strand of your spiritual DNA. So you may be down, but you're never out. You may suffer and struggle, but you will not be overcome. You may feel like your life is over, but it's not. It's never over. Because you have been baptized into Christ, you will always rise to new life. And yes, you're going to suffer. You live in a broken world. People will hurt you and sin against you, but your life is never over because through Jesus' baptism, through Jesus' resurrection, his power is in you, and that power can never be defeated. Many of you knew, or at least knew of, the Reverend Emily Richards. She was a much beloved priest in this diocese for the last 20 years or so, who died of cancer just last month at a very young age. She served at St. Peter's in Glenside and more recently at St. Thomas's in White Marsh. But she was born with rheumatoid arthritis and suffered terribly with it her entire life. She endured innumerable surgeries to try and mitigate the damage that it was doing to her body, but nonetheless, she often required the use of a wheelchair. And I can't possibly communicate in a few sentences what a remarkable person she was, but she truly was a remarkable person. And if you knew her at all, her life just shone with the glory of baptism. Her entire life preached death and resurrection. And her husband, Daniel, spoke at her funeral, and he described the moment that she found out that she had cancer. And he said that he heard her mumbling something to herself through her tears, repeating something to herself over and over like a mantra. And when he asked her what she was saying, she told him that it was a quote from theologian Frederick Buechner. She was repeating to herself over and over, resurrection means that the worst thing is never the last thing. Resurrection means that the worst thing is never the last thing. Resurrection means that the worst thing is never the last thing. That's the promise of baptism. Because of baptism, you may be plunged into suffering and death, but it's never the end. Emily carried that truth in her soul. It was her identity as God's child. She knew that to be baptized was to be buried with Christ in his death, and so to trust in his resurrection. And she had already tasted it so many times. She had experienced it every day of her life as she journeyed through the wilderness, as she carried the cross of her physical affliction. And now as she faced one more battle, her final battle, she faced it with the determined hope as a baptized child of God. And now if you are baptized, you know your own origin story. And your superpower isn't the things that you can do. Those are just the gifts that God has given you. Your superpower is your identity as God's child who will always pass through death and rise to new life. So you are no longer just a mom or a dad, no longer just a grandparent, no longer just a student or just a kid. You're no longer just the employee of the month, no longer just a nice person. Those are all great things, but they're not your superpower. If you have been baptized, everything you experience, every task that you take up, you do as a child of God. Everything you do now is an expression of your baptism, Jesus' own death and resurrection, infusing every moment of your life with resurrection power. So now we follow him through every trial, loving as he loves, trusting as he trusts, overcoming just as he has overcome all things. In every trial, remember who you are. You are baptized. You are a child of God. Know who you are, and not even death can stop you. Amen.